the last section, we finished up our selection reducer so that we are now recording the selected library whenever one is clicked on. I think one of the last things we have to do is now take that selected library ID and import it into the list item and say, hey, if that selected library's ID is equal to this library's ID, then I should show an expanded card section view that includes the detail. So again, I have a component where I want to consume some piece of application level state. Remember how we do that. We add on a map state to props function and then pass it to our connect handler down here. So we will first start out by creating a map state to props function. It will be called with our application state, and from here we will return a plain JavaScript object, and that object will show up as props to our component. So I will return selected library ID, and that is going to be state.selected library ID. Remember, this state.selected library ID property right here, it is specifically selected library ID because when I wired up the reducer to my application, I assigned the reducer to the selected library ID property. So because I assigned this reducer to this property, I now have a selected library ID piece of state. So here is our map state to props function. It is returning an object. The last thing we have to do is make sure we pass this map state to props function as the first argument to our connect handler. So I will pass it in as the first argument to the connect helper. Cool, so now in theory, inside of our component, we can compare this ID right here to this .props.selected library ID, and if they are equal, we should show some expanded amount of detail about this library. So let's try this out. I will say const should expand equals, let's do this with like a nice long, well, what's the best way to do this? Let's do this with a helper function. How about that? I think that's going to be the most clear. I'm going to add on a helper method called render description, and we're going to treat this like some conditional JSX to return. So we'll say if this .props.library.id is equal to this .props.selected library ID, then return, and this is where we will put in some additional amount of JSX right here. Something to say basically, hey, here's the description. So I want to return a text tag for right now, just a text tag that says this .props.library.description. And because it is a reference to a JavaScript variable, I am going to wrap it with curly braces like so. Now, of course, take notice here that I am referring to several properties off of our props object, which means this would be a really good candidate for doing some destructuring, just to condense down the amount of references we have. So let's do that now. Let's say const library, and selected library ID should come from the this.props object. And now I can condense this all down to just library ID equals selected library ID, and then inside the text tag we'll go to just library.description. So make sure you've got library.id, selected library ID, and library.description. Alright, let's save this and test it out in the simulator. Oh, you know what, actually one last thing we got to do, we need to make sure that we are calling the render description method from inside of our render method. So inside of our render method, I'm going to add on a call to this.render description. Cool. Alright, I think we're ready for a test out in the simulator. I will refresh, click on a thing, and awesome! We get our nice description in here. The full-length description, and whenever I click on one and then click on another, the previous one closes because I can only have one selected ID at a time. Okay, so this definitely works out, but the styling is, oof, that is rough. That is some rough styling right there. In addition, you know what? I'm thinking about this render description helper right here, and I'm not super happy about it. I feel like we could maybe do something a little bit better than what I've got right here. Let's continue in the next section and see if we can't refactor this component up a little bit.